All right, everyone, let's grab our seats and we will begin because I want to make sure we leave time for some good Q&A. So just to start, hello everyone. My name is Rich Sucre. I'm the Deputy Director of the Current Planning Division, and I help lead the city's historic preservation program at SF Planning. Since we have a couple of special guests in the audience, I want to make sure we recognize Historic Preservation Commission President Diane Matsuda, as well as Commissioner Bob Vergara, who have both joined us from the HPC, which is great. I also want to recognize my boss, the Director of Current Planning, Liz Waddy, who's hanging out in the back over here, as well as any number of the historic preservation staff that you're seeing within you. So today, we are going to kind of go through an agenda looking at how historic preservation is currently functioning at San Francisco Planning, CEQA and Historic Resources Review, an introduction to the Historic Resource Review application, our categorical exemption checklist, which is an item that we use under CEQA, assignment and staffing at the Planning Department, as well as a quick slide on responses to some questions and comments that we have begun. I do want to note real quick, just to make sure everyone knows, we are definitely in a beta test on this. With everything and with all process improvements, we do want your feedback, and we're going to basically fold in all the feedback with hopefully updates to the application probably by January of next year, because usually it's helpful to kind of let it run. This is pretty typical of how planning works when we're doing these kind of larger process improvements that we're doing, and so I'll kind of go through all of that. So just to start in terms of how preservation currently works at the Planning Department. Right now, obviously we have our Planning Director, Rich Hillis, as well as our current Planning Director, Liz Waddy, and our Environmental Review Officer, Lisa Gibson. So the preservation program kind of sits within two different divisions at SF Planning. It sits in the Current Planning Division, which is responsible for development review, basically permits and land use applications, as well as the Environmental Review Division, which handles our work under the California Environmental Quality Act. So I function as the lead staff and liaison for our Historic Preservation Commission. I also directly manage our landmarks and survey team, as well as I'm the lead staffer for the appeals program. I'll also have our various preservation managers stand up, just because it's nice to put names to faces. So we'll start from the bottom, but Natalia Fossey over here is our lead for District 4, and then she also basically handles the preservation work in the kind of southern half of the city, so Districts 4, 7, 9, 10, and 11. We roughly organize the planning department and our staff by supervisorial district. So we basically have a team of planners assigned to specific districts within the city, and they handle all the review work. And then the preservation team is basically split amongst those geographic areas. Natalia also manages our legacy business program. Elizabeth Gordon-Jung over here, manages our work in Districts 1, District 2, District 5, and District 8. She's also our lead staffer on the Mills Act program. And so she works on a similar role as Natalia, where they work on all the certificates of appropriateness, CEQA applications, permits to alter, and kind of larger scale preservation work. Elizabeth also manages the preservation work in Districts 5 and 8, so like the Castro, Tenderloin, etc. Jonathan Vimmer, over here, is our lead preservation supervisor for Districts 3 and District 6. And then finally, Allison Vanderslice, over here, is our lead preservation planner for EIRs and our Archeo program. So Allison leads our team of archaeologists. She's our main lead for tribal cultural resources as well as for mitigation measures. In addition to the management team that we are very fortunate that we have 23 very qualified preservation planners. So that are split amongst the various geographies and also have different focuses within the planning department. So for example, we have a survey and designation team, and their work basically involves staffing the San Francisco citywide survey as well as the landmark designation work program. We have staff assigned specifically towards work on EIRs and mitigation measures.
We also are lucky to have a preservation planner assigned to our enforcement team, and she also happens to lead the enforcement team as well as a team of planners at various levels working within the specific geographies itself. So within the context of CEQA, obviously, we probably speaking to the choir here, but we have a wide variety of topics that CEQA covers, right? And the California Planning Department is responsible for implementing the city's compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. Cultural resources are one of the topics under CEQA. Within that context, the way that the city organizes our work, or I should say our historic properties and cultural resources, is within a series of categories. Category A means you're historic. Category C means you're not historic. Category B means it's unknown. We've introduced the kind of A star into our mix just to kind of flag our Article 10 and Article 11 properties, and those are properties that are listed in our local landmark designation work program. So Article 10 is our city landmark program. Article 11 is geared towards downtown and our conservation districts. But both of those properties that are in Article 10 and Article 11 require specialized review by our preservation staff. So within the context of CEQA, we're required to do historic resource review. And so typically the historic resource review includes either one, a determination of historic resource, right? Or determining the impact of the historic resource. It's kind of your red pill, blue pill. You choose one, but actually, a lot of times you actually have to do both. But what we're doing when we're doing our review under CEQA is A, seeing if the project is a project, right? Like if it's something that requires our review. Within the city and county of San Francisco, we're required to conduct CEQA review on all discretionary permits or discretionary applications within the city. And then within that context, we also then further look to see what qualifies under our categorical exemption checklist. And then within that context, we're also looking at specifically historical resources and then impacts to historic resources. So there's a whole series of steps that we do, but relative to the work within the historic resources context, we're always asking kind of two questions. Is there a historic resource present? And two, if there is there an impact to that historic resource? And so we've kind of organized all of our applications over time within that context. So currently within San Francisco planning, you have kind of three options for filing for historic review of some type, right? And within the context of CEQA or outside of the context of CEQA, we have the HRA, which was a pilot program that basically was geared towards figuring out if your property is historic or not. We have the Part 1, also known as the HRD or the HRE, that kind of supplemental. That's basically a more formal application that was kind of geared towards when an application has been filed with the planning department, and then CEQA review was required because the extent of the work exceeded what was required under the categorical exemption checklist. A lot of words. And then finally, we also have the Part 2, which was the determination of impact under a historic resource. So our main goal, obviously, with the historic resource review application is to consolidate all three of these applications into one, and we're really mindful about doing this from the public's perspective, quite honestly. It's very confusing from a member of the public to talk to them about HRAs, HRDs, HR1s, any number of iterations of the word historic, and basically tell them, oh, you have to file an application with the planning department, and then try and break down the nuances between them. We're very lucky. We have a very active consulting community, such as all of yourself, which is great. But we're really mindful that the public as a whole has a hard time kind of breaking this down. And so our main goal with the historic resource review was to kind of consolidate these three applications into one and make it agnostic in terms of when the application is filed. So you can file the HRR if you want something as simple as figuring out if your property is historic or not. You can also file the HRR if you have a project in-house with the planning department that requires CEQA review. So ultimately, what the HRR is doing is basically our red pill, blue pill, right? We are looking at seeing that our HRR will yield and result itself in either the determination of historic resource or the impact to historic resources or quite honestly both. So the yield from it and the response for what the planning department produces is one or the other, and based on the work that's basically submitted to us and the need that is required for when a project is submitted to us. The other benefit that we had with the HRR was basically consolidating and reducing our fee. Obviously, our fees, it's not a shop. They can be a little high, and so we looked at the time spent on all of our various applications, and we're able to adjust our fee accordingly based on that work. So the HRR basically can serve within the context of CEQA. It can serve for typical exemptions that we are producing, so similar category exemptions, class 32 exemptions, under our CPEs and GPEs. The HRR can also serve within the context of our NEGDECs and the work that we do on the NEGDECs. The HRR does not work for our EIRs. Obviously, EIRs require a really extensive amount of work with our staff, with the environmental consultants and our teams, and so we will not be using the HRR kind of process in the context of EIRs, and that will also still remain with our environmental planning division and under the supervision of Alison Vandersluis, who currently supervises all of the cultural resource work for EIRs within the city. So when we're looking at when an HRR is actually required, we are also kind of clarifying the actual application process itself. So we recently went through a larger scale redo of all of our project applications, and so the project application is required anytime someone is submitting some type of development application to us. And it documents kind of basics, it tells us what we do and the kind of baseline towards our development projects in the city. We're specifically calling out an HRR as being required for demolition, for complete alterations to front facades, as well as for substantial vertical additions. And this is basically the baseline requirement for whenever an HRR would be required by one of our staff, based on the project that's being submitted to us. The application itself is very familiar. It's very similar to our current applications that we have on file with the HRA and the HRE or HRD. We're asking for basic information such as project address, block, and plot. We are asking to see if it's within historic context or mentioned in that. Obviously we're asking people to make their best attempt at this. Included in prior surveys. A lot of this information is actually available through our property information net on our website, just by typing in the property address. Surprisingly, for those of you that haven't seen, we actually have quite a lot of information on that website. So it's a real great resource for finding out information on a property or an area in the city. We also include a small narrative about researching a specific property. And so we ask for the construction date or your best attempt at the construction date, a look into the building permit's history, water department records, assessor records, which includes the owner information, a review with the San Francisco History Center. We have a superb library staff within the city, and anyone that has ever been to this History Center, hopefully you've gotten the same experience that most of us have, which is a lot of great help in terms of finding a property and researching a specific building. And then lastly, we're now introducing our citywide historic context statements. So our context statements help provide a framework for evaluating historic properties within the city. And so they kind of highlight significant themes, people, places, areas that are within the city itself. And so I'll go into more detail later in the presentation. So just to kind of provide a quick comparison in terms of the before and afters. The HRA and the HRD both include this property, how to research a property's history. And you'll see it's pretty much identical to what we're already seeing in the HRR application. We did have a kind of extra other research collections which you can kind of consult, which is still available for you. Keep in mind, there's actually a wide variety of places where you can research a property's history. SF Heritage has a wonderful archive, the California Historical Society, the Environmental Design Library at UC Berkeley. Any number of places still contain a lot of places to kind of look for a building's history or old photographs, for example. And so we're making a pretty strong corollary between the two. Within that context, and especially to kind of build upon our context statements and the work that we're doing within that, we're trying to make it a little easier for everyone. And keep in mind, we have to organize our applications so that it can be filed by the layman that wants to undertake the work on themselves. Or if they want to make it easier, hire a consultant, right? Like that's often like the polemic or the dynamic that we have to do. We can't just make something overly specific that a homeowner themselves couldn't undertake. But obviously, we also advise that it might be easier on yourself and more quick to hire a consultant to kind of do the work for you and kind of do this research. The historic context statements that we've been working on, they're either geographically focused, architecturally focused, thematic. They've been adopted and they kind of set our standard for what we think is historic. All of our context statements are adopted by the Historic Preservation Commission and require review by the city's historical resource body. This just gives a little snapshot of what have adopted since 2020. We also have a whole series of context statements that are in progress right now in terms of trying to flush out work and major themes within the city itself. So right now we have current context statements in progress in Sunset, Bay Area traditional styles. We also have a whole series of cultural contexts, and given the historic preservation's race and social equity resolution, which was adopted, we put a lot of resources into getting our major cultural contexts adopted, and we're aiming to get most of these adopted by the end of the year, if not early Q1 of 2024. And that includes the African American citywide historic context statement. We have an open forum scheduled in early September, which is a huge achievement. Latino citywide historic context statement, the Chinese American citywide historic context statement, and the American Indian historic context statement, all of which are underway in various forms with the planning department. Just to kind of give you an idea and kind of give you more information on SF Survey, because I think more information is always good, this gives you a little snapshot of where we have been and where we're going in our rough timeline. Obviously, progress, I'm not going to lie, is slow. It takes a lot of time to do both the research that's necessary to make sure that the work is done right. We have cultural competency kind of at the forefront of a lot of our work, and so a lot of our work is community driven. So like that is one of the key things to keep in mind as you're all working on these projects. We have to do extensive community processes to make sure that we get buy-in from the people that this is most effective. Old system of doing it was great. Experts in the field come in and tell me what is historic from our property. We still have that, but we have to make sure that there's enough buy-in and understanding on the ground to make sure that the people that are being impacted by this really know what this means and what is going on in their neighborhoods. And ultimately, right, historic property is best if your neighborhood basically or your owners like really buy into that at the end of the day. So. Just to kind of give you an idea in terms of where we are in terms of field work, this is our kind of phase one, and you will see that we're pretty much focusing on our neighborhood commercial corridors throughout the city. And that's primarily because the neighborhood commercial corridors are also going to be the areas of focus resulting from our housing element. The housing element obviously created a mandate for us to create 82,000 units over the next 20 years. And so there's a massive rezoning effort that's happening. Getting information out early is always better when we're starting to look at rezoning and the potential for new development within the city. Moving on to our categorical exemption checklist, I'm giving you a little snapshot of where we were and where we've been, basically. So this checklist here is used primarily for when our staff have to undertake CEQA review on a specific project. Most of, I'd say, Chelsea, can you? I feel like it's around like 85% of the projects that were reviewed are subject to a categorical exemption of some kind. And so that means usually the bulk of them fall within a Class 1 and a Class 3 exemption. Within that way, the way we're documenting our proposed work is by certain scopes that we know are either minor in nature or ancillary to the larger project itself. And so we have made refinements in that list to make sure that we can kind of capture the world of projects that are subject to the categorical exemption checklist. In addition to that, we're refining how the preservation planners do their work as well. We've made made it more scope agnostic and more about how the determination by the preservation planner relative to impacts on character defining features and historic resources, as well as consistency. So one of the things that we've added in here now that we did not have before is a requirement for comments, basically the requirement for some kind of explanation for why did the preservation planner undertake the work relative to the scope that's before them. So how does all this work? I don't know, I won't say demystifying, but relative to how a HRR or an application works through our process, we have the HRR. It's produced by a consultant or an owner, right? That consultant can be an architect, a historic resource consultant, whoever. It goes to our intake team. Our intake team is responsible for doing a completeness check. So one of the things that I will tell everyone, since we have great people in this room, read our applications. If it's asking for something, it means that we want it, and it means we will not accept your application until it is provided to us. So that whole back and forth is usually because something did not get submitted to us that we asked for. Small secret. The intake team will then create a record number. That record number pops up on PIM, and so that's your first indication. And PIM is updated daily at the end of the day. So anytime someone processes a permit, for example, that PIM record, or that record, will not show up on PIM until the following day. Just another little clue. From when the record number is created and the application is accepted, it's routed to a planner floor. So it's routed to one of the 3 supervisors that I introduced earlier. One of the 3 supervisors will then route it to a preservation planner. And one of the big things that we're doing with HRR now is guaranteeing a determination within 45 days, pending any additional information, just to put that up there as a little caveat. So we're trying to basically create a little more surety around our process, right? We're trying to create a little bit more consistency and also not deviate too heavily from what we've already been doing, right? Like the HRA and the HRD are both asking for the same thing. And then even down to the part 2, the part 2 isn't used, quite frankly, as frequently as we used to use probably like 10 years ago, quite honestly, relative to all of that. So what we're aiming for at the end of the day is to try and answer those 2 questions, which is, am I historic or not, right? Or is the building or an area historic or not? Or is there an impact to a historic resource at the end of the day? And what the staff will do on our end is basically complete that answer for you or for your projects. So what does the preservation planner do, right? So this is kind of the big mystery, I think, within all of this. Surprisingly, they're doing a lot of review, right? They're kind of doing a spot check on the material that's been provided for the applicant. They're also conducting supplemental research. And that's the big thing to remember is we have 23 preservation staff in the planning department. And they are all historians themselves. They have worked in preservation. They have done any number, they're also conservators. Like, there's any number of roles that they played. They do a lot of supplemental research to the applications that have been provided based on their knowledge of the history. And since we're organizing our planner specifically into certain geographies, it also helps them focus in on those specific neighborhoods, try and make sure that they understand like what's been important over time, what are the major themes that a certain neighborhood might have. So they will be doing the occupant research. I will be full disclosure, the occupant research that we have gotten to date is spotty, probably a 50-50. So from compared to what we see in the HRA and the HRD, where 50% of it is really good, 50% of it is not so good. And so we basically made a call on management's end to say, well, our staff can conduct that research ourselves through the various access points that we have towards census records, data rolls, city directories, our own files, libraries, as well as the additional archival research that they conduct on the day-to-day. So I know there's a lot of questions on how we're capturing the category B, and that's really what we're trying to hone in on, is basically make sure that you all know that like our staff also have to do work on the applications based on what's been submitted to us. The preservation staff will then confirm if they need to produce a determination of historic resource status or a determination of impact to historic resource, and then provide the response as well as any kind of associated with SQL work. So the SQL work would happen if a project has actually been submitted to us, Or if a project is not, then fine, it's a determination to see if your building is historic or not. Remember that people use historical resources, or they come to the planning department quite honestly to kind of gut check. I'm planning on a project on my house. I don't know if my project's historic or not. You know, we can tell them to consult an architect, a preservation person, but sometimes they don't want to, or frankly don't want to spend the money on it. So they can hopefully do the work themselves if they choose to, and then we would flush it out. Or if they're smart, they would hire one of you and then make it much easier on themselves. But I will say this, knowing that we are a public agency, we have to accommodate for both, quite honestly. So we have to accommodate for the small homeowner as well as for the giant developer when we're looking at all of our applications. So whenever you submit an HRR, it will go to one of the three people that are shown on the screen here. If you're working on EIR or mitigation work, it will go to Allison, and then she will assign it out to one of our various staff or one of her staff. So this is just to kind of, I don't want to say demystify, but there's a little bit of demystification of kind of like how the planning department has been working to date. I'm very happy that a couple of you have provided some good comments on the current drafts that were out there. And keep in mind, we did release it early upon request. So easiest way to transmit this information to the public is to upload it onto our website. So just remember that the HRR can be prepared by anyone. However, for demolition, we're requiring a preservation professional that meets the Secretary of Interior standards to produce the HRR and the associated reports. And we also will require scoping for the consultant prepared HRRs. So we're still having that consultant requirement, particularly for demos. For photographs, just make sure you identify the subject property. Call out the property that you're actually working on within the photographs that you plan to us. Remember that planning staff will be conducting supplementary research. So we're not requiring occupant history in the submittal. That will be covered by our staff when the application is provided to us. And similarly, if there's other events that occurred on the property outside of the building permit, such as like your observations in terms of field work, that you might, or field assessments that you might make of a property, or anecdotal evidence that, you know, like a homeowner might have built this deck on their own with no permits, which, you know, is antithetical to how we work at the planning department. But, you know, you can kind of put that kind of information in there, and I will say this, we are not the police. We are not going to be opening up enforcement and tracking down these homeowners to do that. Just want to be clear about that. We have a whole enforcement process that kind of handles that. And just remember that planning staff may request additional information as needed. You know, our information is only as good as the now. Like, I just want to be clear on that. Like, we know a lot of information, but we also rely on our community partners to provide information to us, like to basically give us a red flag if someone significant lived in a property, or if a property had been associated with historical events or something that might not be as evident upon looking at the kind of basics and the kind of typical stuff that you're seeing in history. You know, I will say even our staff even work on things as simple as Google. It's amazing actually what you find now in the interwebs. It's a wild thing. And then just remember again that consultant prepared HRRs do require scoping, especially as related to work within one of our area plans or within our GRE, Chelsea, help me? GPE, thank you. GPEs. So the GPEs are now the general plan evaluations, which are similar to our CPEs, which were our community plan evaluations. Basically, like environmental work that is tiered off of a larger area plan EIR, so like the housing element, or for example, the Eastern neighborhoods EIR. So I just want to thank you all for listening to me. I know it can be a little mind-numbing, but now this is the good stuff. This is the Q&A, and we're really happy to answer questions, or provide insight in terms of where we're going. I just want to stress again, we're kind of in a beta right now in hopes of consolidating these three applications into one, right? Our main goal in this was getting
better public process, right? We actually review thousands of projects every year, and it's amazing what is confusing when you start kind of talking planaries or CEQA-E's to them. And what we're trying to do at the end of the day is make this a little bit more easier for everyone to understand, and also provide better access to the information that is out there for everyone. So that's all. If you have a question, Natalia will come around and just raise your hand, and we're happy to answer.
Thank you, Rich. Can everyone hear me?
Sure. I'll repeat your question just because we're recording this as well.
Great. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes late. I'm sorry if I missed this. I just wanted to make sure I understood the timing implication for when an HRR is filed, specifically the implication on whether or not and when other applications could be filed on the property. So in reference to the whole HRA.
Yep. So right now we don't have a time restriction on the HRR like we did with the HRA. So our current process would not let you file an HRA if you had a development application active with the planning department. So it basically said if you had a permit on file, if you had a permit on file, you did not qualify for the HRA, you could only file a Part 1 or the Part 2. Now we're agnostic in terms of time. And so what we're aiming for is the scope at the end of the day. So trying to understand from you, do I want to get an evaluation of my property on whether or not it's a historic resource under the California Register or National Register? That's ultimately what you can now file the HRR for. Rich?
Rich, I have a couple. Okay, I have a couple questions about the scoping process. So, why would you need to scope the HRR if it's like this basic information that we're providing? Like, what would scoping? Are you anticipating that a consultant written one would have more information than what is in the application?
I think yes, because I would say this, for demolition in particular, like we are hoping that the scoping sessions, like that the consultant and us are on the same page in terms of information that we need and with the assessments, and or that the information that you need are clear in terms of what is required, basically. So in most cases, we're not going to be asking for an assessment under CEQA unless it's required for a neg deck or one of the higher level documents, but we are going to be asking to see if there's context statement information that might need to be fleshed out, or, like, remember, the context statements provide a good framework towards a topic, but we all know, like, they're not super detailed in a lot of cases, and there might be a history associated with a property that needs to get better documented or better fleshed out for us to make a more clearer determination at the end of the day. And so we're really mindful that, particularly for demo, that we need to make sure that we're a little bit more conservative with demolitions than we are with the kind of typical day-to-day projects.
But we would not need to scope it if it's not a demo.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So on slide 11, you said an HRR is required for demolition